Morgantown for me has always been like a place of community. Everyone is everyone's neighbor. And honestly, like if you don't know anybody there, it won't take 5 seconds before you already have a friend. Like it's that kind of community.
My mom and dad moved us here in 91, 92. It was a fabulous place to be raised. I love raising my kids there.
We were all living in one house. It was my mom and papa, and then my sister, my parents, and then my mom's siblings, and then Angie's kids were there as well.
Angie had a boyfriend in high school, and they actually went on to have 2 children. And then things did not work out between them, and they separated. Well, our parents were not exactly thrilled because both of us became young mothers. They basically were 100% supportive. Yep, we were very, very close.
Angie was the best sister. Me and her, we're only 2 years apart. With her, she was my best friend.
She was free-spirited. A rainy day, she came into the room, you would never thought it was raining.
Oh, Angie was a firecracker. She always had the loudest laugh. That was just infectious.
So me and Angie, we went and got food. And she said, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell mom and dad. I was like, okay, lay it on me. What do we got? And she's like, I've met someone. I was like, well, okay, like, what's his name? Joey.
I remember her saying that he had come to her work and he was kind of like following her around the store, maybe found her attractive.
Angie was very into like the emo scene, dark clothes. She was like a rocker girl. Joey was very much that rocker type boy.
I remember it like when she brought him over. Mom was very on the defensive, very protective. And dad was like, well, let's play this out and see, prove to me that you're a decent person, prove to me that you're good enough to date my daughter kind of thing. I talked to Joey about that, and I went up to him and I was like, she really likes you. She really cares about you. Please be good to her. He said that he would.
I remember the first time that I met Joey. I was at my mom and papa's house and I was sitting in the living room, and that's when Angie walked in with Joey. I remember he leaned down to show me the tattoo he had on his shoulder, and it was a 666 tattoo. I remember his exact words to me were, I got this tattoo to show that even in good, there's always some evil.
Growing up in Morgantown, a small community, we were raised Christian. So when I seen him with all kinds of tattoos, I was like, okay, I don't know really how to feel about this.
Morgantown is very small, pretty tight-knit community. Everybody knows everybody, basically.
I think with Joey, it was outside of the norm of what you would expect to see in really anybody in our community. It kind of drew Angie in the sense of this was something different.
She seemed happy. It was a, new relationship, and things were really, really good. In 2012, Angie and Joey decided that they were going to get married.
I asked her, are you sure you want to do this? Does he make you happy? And she said, yeah, He does.
We did a little reception at my uncle's house, and everything went really well. I think in the beginning, she seemed happy. He treated her older two kids okay, and I think that we were happy that she was happy.
We were absolutely delighted. And nice to see, her and all the kids, just happy.
Angie decided she wanted to be a certified nursing assistant. She loved it. She loved it so much. Her and I worked together at a long-term care and rehab facility. Angie not only, worked her full-time hours, but she worked overtime every single week. A lot of times we would go in together and we would actually work like doubles, which are 16-hour shifts.
My sister, was working almost every day. But later on in the relationship, we started seeing he would not work. He wouldn't work.
I remember he got a job one time at, I believe it was a UPS shipping facility. He worked there for maybe a few months, and then he quit. And then his reason for quitting was that it was boring, and that was it.
What made me more mad than anything was that Joey would get mad when she took days off, when she didn't pick up a shift. He said it was lost money, money that she wasn't bringing in.
He liked being home. He liked, only doing those bare minimal things, and that Angie not only paid all the bills, but she got to where she was even giving him an allowance.
He told everybody that it was because he was a stay-at-home dad.
The house never got cleaned, and I remember that. I saw that. The house was a wreck. The kids were in dirty clothes. Laundry wasn't done. I wish I would have said something then. But, Angie was doing everything that she could.
This man didn't even have, a driver's license. If he needed to go anywhere or needed to be dropped off, he had to wake Angie up to do it.
The more I got to hang out over there, I guess Joey felt like he could be more comfortable with, me around. Playing on, video games, he would get, violent, yell, throw the controller. And so for me, it was if he's acting like this, now, what's he doing behind closed doors? Angie, I was like, is he violent towards you? Does he yell at you? Does he hit you? All the time it was, no, he doesn't do anything like that. Joey wouldn't do that. Something in my gut was just I don't like him.
I started asking questions, and then Angie kind of lost contact with us.
My parents, they got concerned. Even her phone had been shut off, or she had gotten a new phone number, and so no one had a way of communicating with her.
Looking back, I guess that was the beginning of him just trying to gain control. Just trying to maybe distance Angie from mom and dad.
My whole family, if there's a reason for us to get together and celebrate something, we're gonna do it. We have 50 people that show up for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, and all of a sudden she was not showing up to those things.
He just kind of, slowly did it over time. It was, oh, I don't want to go. If you go, you're saying that it's okay that they don't like me, that they treat me differently. And then she would be guilted into staying home. Joe definitely had put a lot of strain on Angie with making her feel as if she had to choose between Joe or her family.
Me, mom, dad, everybody, was blocked. Like on Facebook, phone numbers, all that.
I remember mom crying about it. I remember dad crying about it.
I remember they were in the church parking lot and we had pulled up to park and we went to say hi. Joey, kind of shoved the kids in the car, shoved Angie, and they sped out of there. And I remember my mom and papa being like just so upset because they just wanted to see their daughter and their grandkids. And I was worried for my Aunt Angie. I was worried for my cousins.
That is what prompted her mom to reach out to the Child Protective Services.
That's whenever, I guess you'd say, everything started hitting the fan.
The house was a wreck. It was disgusting. It was awful. Like, honestly, if social services had seen the house like that, those kids would have been removed right then and there, no questions asked.
It really did escalate because my parents were so immersed in their grandkids' lives that someone to just say, no, you're not seeing your grandkids anymore, was just heartbreaking for my parents. They were the type of grandparents that always wanted their grandkids around them. They were happiest when they had all their grandkids around them.
I think for mom and dad, they feared for the safety of the kids, and I think they knew that maybe they could do something to help those babies.
I think her mom thought, if I can get the kids out of there, then Angie will follow. But that didn't happen. Joe was able to really spin that and make it to where her mom was now the enemy.
Her kids had practically been raised in and around my parents' home. All of a sudden, they were not allowed to be around any of our family.
Mom and dad not seeing the grandbabies hurt mom and dad more than anything else. I remember Angie reaching out to dad. She came to the house and she started crying and she hugged dad. And she's like, I'm so sorry for everything that I had done. It was heartwarming, I guess. But it felt good because it was a bridge. It may not have been a sturdy bridge, but it was a start.
She finally started to come back around, and Joey would also come around with her. They would typically visit for about an hour at a time. It would be an hour on the dot, and Joey was, okay, it's time to go. We need to go home now. It was like she was a prisoner, and this was her hour of recess. In 2013, Angie and Joey had their first kid together. That was Violet, a little girl. And then they had their second child, Archer.
I think that she really thought that maybe that was going to make him change his ways, that maybe things would turn around.
Shortly after she had Violet, I remember her telling me she couldn't be around any other men at all without Joe. He would, go through her phone, her text messages, her Facebook, and then that would turn into, a confrontation with him. He would push her, he would hold her up against the wall. When he got something in his head and wanted to fight about something, there was no getting away. She had tried to leave before, and he would tell her that if she didn't come back or if she didn't talk to him, that he would kill himself, that it would be her fault.
She did leave Joey for a very short amount of time. She moved in with Mama and Papa and all of us with her kids. That was when she started to explain, like, Joey is abusive. He refused to get a job, and that when she would get paid, he would take control of her paychecks and her bank accounts and basically just leave Angie with just enough money for the bills. We were all just kind of like, leave him. Like, you cannot put yourself through this. You can't put your kids through this. Like, you have to get out of this relationship. And she would be like, I'm going to. And then she ended up going back with him.
It seemed like it was just a back and forth. And it became almost exhausting, where it was like they'd be okay for a couple of months. There'd be a fight. She'd leave. She'd stay at Mom and Dad's for a few days. They'd make up. It was a cycle. It was a cycle.
Every time she would run away from him, she would run to my parents. And so there was always just that fear that, well, they're going to be caught up in the middle of this.
Joey would send threats all the time, telling her, like, I'm going to put a bullet in your brain, your mom's brain, and your dad's brain if you ever leave me.
Joey came to the point where he was being more aggressive, being more violent, and Angie, she knew she couldn't do anything if she was dead. She couldn't protect her babies if she was gone.
So Angie had called me on Facebook. I messaged her as soon as I had woken up. And I was like, hey, what did you call for? And then she said protection. Joe had me pinned in the bathroom. It got so bad.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back. This was when she said, I've got to get out of here. I've got to do something to get out of this.
I knew that he was going to do something. I knew he was going to take matters in his own hands, and I was scared for him.
We are all at my cousin Renee's house, and we've got, a fire going, and we're roasting marshmallows. I see my mom answering her phone, and I said, what's going on? She said, don't say anything. Angie left Joey. And again, in my mind, I'm just like, oh, here we go again, for the umpteenth time.
I sat there and I remember saying, I was like, I won't believe it until the divorce papers are signed. I told them that. I was like, I won't hold my breath.
She was different this time, and she was done. And it was very evident that she was done.
I asked, I was like, well, how's he taking it? And she was like, oh, he won't stop blowing up my phone. Like, I have to literally, put him on, do not disturb. And I'm like, really? Like, that much? And I was like, so now that he realizes what he's done and what a piece of trash he is, now he wants to come running back. And Angie's just like, he's got nowhere to run to. She was like, I'm done with him. I loved hearing that. That was like a weight off my shoulder.
Those first couple of months, I was skeptical, and I was thinking, okay, this probably isn't gonna last long, but I'll just enjoy it while it is, Then, it kind of got to that point where it had been the longest she was away, and I could tell how happy she was.
It's like 7 a.m. I'm sitting there in bed and I just, hear, a knock at my door. Then the door just opens and like she's standing there, hands on her hips. She goes, "New me. The world is my oyster." She's like, and I am finally taking a hold of my life.
We were thrilled. I mean, the whole family, it was basically like a party. I mean, we were so happy that she had left him.
Angie eventually met somebody new, and when I say that he was a complete 180 from Joey, I'm happy to say that he was. Like, she didn't have a bad word to say about him.
Wes, I mean, he loved her so much. He was just smitten with her. He treated her nice. He wasn't pushing her out the door saying, it's time to go, it's time to leave. He just had a great relationship with all of us. Christmas was really great. We had everybody there. And it was probably one of the most stress-free Christmases that we had, especially with Angie. We knew she was done with Joey. We knew that this chapter was kind of closing, and we were just so happy for her, happy for her kids, and it was just really great. I think she finally opened her eyes to, what he's doing is wrong. It's always been wrong. I can get out of this situation and be okay. And I think that's when she finally decided to put in the divorce paperwork.
When she finally decided to divorce him, he wouldn't sign the papers. But I know for a fact that she did. She had a lawyer. She had everything. She even sat there, got a new phone number, got a new bank account, everything to separate from him.
His state of mind at that point when the divorce papers were coming was not good. He was angry. He was just constantly texting my sister, calling my sister, harassing my sister.
When she wasn't answering, he was calling her oldest daughter. He would call her mom, and then he was calling her dad. I mean, they weren't even able to use their phones because he was just constantly calling.
He was losing control at that point, I think, and that's what started to scare him.
Joey started to tell Angie that he was depressed and that he wanted to kill himself, and started saying some very disturbing things.
He threatened to drink bleach. He also made the comment that he was going to do it whenever he had the kids.
She told him she doesn't feel comfortable leaving the kids with him by himself because she was worried that he might actually kill himself in front of them, and she didn't want her kids to see that. And so she told him, I need you to get help. I'm gonna keep the kids away for a little bit. I think that was when he finally went full psycho.
He did threaten her life. He said, if I can't have you, no one can. He threatened mom and dad. One point he said, if there was a real life purge, he was I'd go to your mom and dad's house and kill them.
Her lawyer did suggest that she gets a emergency protective order against Joe. Her and her lawyer had decided it was best to have no contact, no telling Joe where the kids were, of what they were, what they were doing. It was basically just gonna go cold turkey.
Myself, my parents, we all said, we're scared for you. We're scared for you, Angie. I'm scared of what he's gonna do. What if he shows up?
This is one of the texts that Joe had sent. Okay, I'll give it to the end of the day. Then, like I said 2 days ago, I tried to play nice, tried to leave it be, but now you are not replying and not answering, so I will be handling things accordingly. Reading this, I don't think that she was thinking that this meant that he was going to show up with a gun to her home, but now we know that that's exactly what he meant.
Where's your emergency? Oh my God, my son! Oh God, you gotta get someone over here! Ma'am, what is your address? Where's your emergency? Oh my God, my son! Oh God, you gotta get someone over here! I just brought my son here to pick up the kids. Why would you do something like this? Jesus Christ. Oh my God. Oh ma'am, I can't understand you. Now, is it your son that was shot or her? Her.
My cousin is at home. Her husband is on fire and rescue, so he has a police scanner, and it came across that there was a male not breathing on Lonnie Snodgrass Road. They even gave the exact address.
I was in my office when I got a message from my cousin. I got told that an ambulance is heading to my house.
My dad had COPD, he was 79, he had health issues. I actually thought that it was something with my dad.
I was working at the hospital, and my brother Jonathan calls. He sounded troubled, and he was like, Tony, I think something's going on with Mom and Dad. Can you go check on them? Can you go and see them? And I was like, okay, yeah.
I reached my niece, and she said, Joey showed up with a gun. She said, Mama told me to grab the baby and go to the closet and lock the door.
Please leave your message.
I'm calling my mom, and I'm calling my mom, and I'm calling my mom, and she doesn't answer.
I was at work that day when I got the call from the Kentucky State Police that we'd had a homicide. When I got to the home and made entry into the home, obviously it was unlike any crime scene I'd ever been to before.
The current time is 11:10 at the scene of a shooting. We'll be doing a walk through the residence.
As you breach the door threshold, Miss Carey was located prone on her back. She had substantial wounds evident of gunfire. A few further feet inside the residence was Miss McGranahan. To the area on the wall and just above her head was a blood pattern impact that indicated that she had been shot at close range. Located on the couch of that residence were multiple casings, indicating that Joseph Carey had entered the threshold of that door prior to firing on Lupe McGranahan.
We're currently in the living room area, transitioning into the dining room, kitchen, magazine floor, multiple shell casings.
As you made your way in through the residence, there was various casings scattered across the living room and the dining room floor, kind of indicating the path that Joseph Carey would have taken as he had entered the residence.
This is the laundry room area. Additional individuals deceased.
Chuck actually was located inside the utility room
It appears that the incident was contained to the interior of the residence and the front driveway.
The scene itself just looked like a nightmare and a normal life of people that had been interrupted by, just a horrific event.
They already had a state trooper that was blocking the road. And so I pulled in.
Get there, I see some ambulances, and I keep thinking that like my mom or dad are gonna come out of this ambulance.
A first aid responder, she just looks at me and she's like, starts shaking her head and she's like, "I'm so sorry." She told me that Joseph Carey showed up with a gun and shot and killed my sister, my mom, and my dad.
My brother comes to me and he says, "They're all gone." And I said, what do you mean? I'm like, "What do you mean they're all gone?" And he said, Joey showed up and they're all gone. I didn't really know what to do at that point.
We remember seeing Joey get taken in a police car. I remember that. I'll never forget I locked eyes with him too. And when I looked at him, it wasn't human. It was evil.
The police already had him in custody, and he was transported from the scene to a state police post where they conducted a full interview.
We now needed to determine what would cause Joseph Carey to essentially execute all three individuals of his very close and immediate family.
I wasn't there. I didn't get to speak to you the first time. So if you could just walk me through your day, kind of let me know what happened and what your thought process was.
I went down to go speak to Angela, that was the mother of my kids, my wife. She came to the door with the door closed and was like, "You need to leave." I said, "Can I just see the kids? That's all I want." She said, "You can talk to them through the door."
Mr. Carey, he had stated that he'd gone to the residence to get the children. I believe they were in the process of getting a divorce, and that he was trying to see the children.
And then that's when Loopy, Angela's mother, told Chuck to get the shotgun because I was staying too long. And that's when everything kind of went chaotic. She said, "Go get the shotgun." And I seen him passing through to the actual laundry room where I knew they kept the shotgun.
I think Mr. Carey wanted to convey to us that he had made those actions because he had been forced to make those actions.
The bullet thing that you're saying escalated the situation today was Loopy telling Chuck to go get the shotgun.
Yes. I was trying to save myself and the kids. And what went through my mind was just not letting him get a shotgun to where he could do something. I don't even know how in my mind my solution was better. I should have ran or something.
Has Chuck ever pulled a shotgun on you before?
No.
Carey stated multiple times that his primary concern with Chuck is that he was going to retrieve specifically a shotgun in the house that he knew or suspected to be located in the utility room of the residence. Chuck did enter that utility room. There was a shotgun present in that utility room. However, it wasn't loaded.
I mean, can't tell you any more than what I've already told you, really. I just said get the shotgun. I panicked. I did. My anxiety kills me most of the time, and when I heard that, my heart rate went, whoop. I followed him. I just boom, 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 boom. Right. You can boom, boom, boom. Right. And then boom, boom, boom.
I'll interject this. I'm willing to play the buy your I panic story. I'll buy it. She had no firearm. She didn't accost you.
I agree.
She didn't assault you. She was in no way, shape, or form even arguably a threat.
Yeah.
She made no motion to a firearm.
No.
And you shot her.
Yes.
I think it's very important to remember that Angie McGranahan and Lupe McGranahan were found in very close proximity to one another, neither one of them having a gun on them, and that he had no right, Joseph Carey, to take their lives or to come in that home at all, even if he thought someone was going to get a gun.
So I've been listening to what you're telling me, okay? And some of the stuff's not adding up, okay?
Okay. I'll tell you right now, I'm guilty of what I did. I cannot sit there and around and say I didn't hurt him or kill him.
Well, I mean, we know that. What we're trying to understand is why.
I'm telling you it was panic, but I ain't gonna lie to you, there's probably more to it than that. But I honestly jumped when I heard the shotgun thing. That was just after the perceived threat.
Well, you was after one of three.
Well, I understand that, but I'm saying that was my main goal, was to stop him.
But what I'm getting at is Lupe was this way, he was this way.
I get you.
Your wife was here, he was this way.
I get you.
I think he was very much aware of the decisions that he was making while he was present. I think he was aggravated with the custody agreement, and possibly emotions were slightly elevated upon hearing that his kids would potentially be taken from him.
Yeah, after I shot Chuck, I walked back by Angie, and that's when I heard the Google noise. That was bothering me a lot. And I think, I can't tell you for sure, but I do think I did shoot again to get it to stop.
He was charged with 2 counts murder, 1 count murder, domestic violence, and I believe 3 counts of wanton endangerment. The Commonwealth of Kentucky is a death penalty state, and we knew most likely, just given the numbers of deceased individuals on scene, that would most definitely be something pursued by the Commonwealth's office.
When the suggestion of death penalty came up for Joey, I was in full support of it. The sooner he's dead, the better. I'm not gonna lie, the plea deal turned my stomach. After the evil you committed, you somehow still think that you're worthy of a plea. It was only after Blake explained that with a plea deal, it's done, it's over, there was no appealing. It was life in prison without the possibility of parole.
In looking at intent in a case like this, of what Mr. Carey's intent might have been, I believe he went to that residence to kill Angie McGranahan. I believe that Lupe and Chuck's deaths were just a result of them being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Joseph Carey shot Angie simply because she made it very clear that he was not going to have access to the children.
It was obvious that this was really just a cold-blooded, brutal murder of 3 people, 3 lives taken away from a family. That just really added another level to me of evil.
He was a monster. And they were 3 beautiful souls who were loved and just missed every single day. And every day is hard without them, even now.
They were definitely a safety net for me. You know, I felt like I was a tightrope walker, you know, and if I did fall, like, they were there.
My sister lived for her kids and ultimately died for her kids. And there's no greater sacrifice, you know,
I can't sum up one thing I miss about Angie. I miss my best friend. I miss my storyteller, my secret keeper, my confidant. 'Cause she was that and more. And not a day goes by that I don't think about them.
On an ordinary autumn evening in the Bronx, inside a quiet apartment building in Castle Hill, a call for help was placed to emergency services. It was the kind of call that New York City police officers receive thousands of times every year. A person was in crisis. A neighbor had heard shouting. There were concerns about unusual behavior. Someone needed assistance. But within minutes, a situation that began as a request for help would end with a 66-year-old woman lying wounded inside her own home, and with a city forced to confront a painful question. What happens when the people called to protect someone are unable to save them? Her name was Deborah Danner. She was not a criminal. She was not a violent offender. She was a woman who had spent much of her life living with a serious mental illness and trying to navigate a world that often misunderstood people like her. For decades, Deborah lived with schizophrenia. She knew the fear, confusion, and isolation that could come with the illness. She understood what it meant to experience moments when reality became difficult to separate from the thoughts and fears inside her own mind. But Deborah was not defined only by her diagnosis. She was a writer. She was someone who attempted to explain her experiences rather than hide from them. In 2011, she published a memoir titled My Mama's Love, a life journey of faith and triumph, a deeply personal account of her struggles, her faith, and her effort to survive the challenges that came with mental illness. Through her writing, Deborah tried to give people a glimpse into a world that many never see. A world where fear does not always come from outside threats. A world where a person can appear calm one moment and overwhelmed the next. A world where compassion and patience can sometimes make the difference between safety and tragedy. And yet, years after sharing her story with others, Deborah would become known across the country for a different reason. Not because of her book. Not because of her courage. But because of the final moments of her life. The evening of October 18, 2016, began like many other days for Deborah. She was inside her apartment in the Jamie Towers housing complex in the Bronx. Outside, New York City continued moving as it always did. Cars traveled through busy streets. People returned home from work. Families prepared dinner. The city carried on with the endless rhythm of millions of lives happening at once. But inside Deborah's apartment, something was wrong. Neighbors became concerned after hearing her shouting and noticing behavior that suggested she was experiencing a mental health crisis. Someone made the decision to call 911. That decision was made because someone believed Deborah needed assistance. Not punishment. Not confrontation. Help. When police officers and emergency medical personnel arrived, they were responding to what is commonly known as an emotionally disturbed person call. It was not a report of a robbery. It was not a report of an armed attack. It was not a report of a person wanted for a crime. It was a call involving a vulnerable woman who was believed to be struggling. These calls are among the most difficult situations faced by first responders. Unlike traditional police encounters, there is often no clear suspect, no obvious crime scene, and no simple solution. The person in crisis may be frightened. They may misunderstand what is happening around them. They may react to things others cannot see or understand. For officers, the challenge is not only controlling a situation. The challenge is understanding it. And on that night in the Bronx, every decision made in a matter of minutes would later be examined again and again. When officers entered Deborah's apartment, they found her holding a pair of scissors. The situation appeared dangerous. But according to testimony later presented in court, emergency medical personnel were able to communicate with her. They spoke with her. They attempted to calm her. And eventually, Deborah put down the scissors. For a brief moment, it appeared the crisis might be moving toward a peaceful resolution. A moment that seemed to show exactly why patience and communication are so important during mental health emergencies. But then another officer arrived. Sergeant Hugh Barry entered the apartment. What happened next would become the central question of the entire case. According to Barry's account, Deborah later picked up a wooden baseball bat and moved toward him. He said he believed he was about to be struck and that he had only moments to react. He fired 2 shots. Deborah Danner was hit. The woman who had once written about her struggles with mental illness was now critically wounded inside her own home. She was transported to Jacobi Medical Center, but she did not survive. The news spread quickly. A 66-year-old woman. A woman living with schizophrenia. A woman who had been inside her own apartment. A woman whose neighbors had called authorities because they were worried about her. Now she was dead after an encounter with the very people who had arrived to help. For many people across New York City, the case became another painful chapter in a larger national conversation about police use of force, particularly when officers encounter people experiencing mental health crises. The question was immediate and difficult. Could this have ended differently? Could more time have been given? Could more communication have been used? Could the outcome have been changed without a gun being fired? Those questions would follow the case for years. The investigation would examine every second of the encounter. Witness statements would be analyzed. Police procedures would be questioned. The actions of the officers, the decisions made inside the apartment, and the training provided to handle mental health emergencies would all come under intense public scrutiny. The case would eventually lead to criminal charges against Sergeant Hugh Barry, an unusual step in a police shooting case. But even before the courtroom battles began, Deborah Danner's death had already become something larger than one tragic night. It became a symbol. A symbol of the difficult intersection between mental illness and law enforcement. A symbol of the consequences that can occur when a crisis is met with force instead of time. And most importantly, it became the story of a woman who was more than the circumstances of her death. Deborah Danner was a daughter, a neighbor, a writer, a person who spent years trying to explain her reality to a world that often struggled to understand it. Her final moments would become the subject of debate among politicians, police leaders, legal experts, and communities across the country. But before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the arguments over responsibility and accountability, there was simply Deborah. A woman who needed help. A woman whose life was reduced, in many people's eyes, to a single tragic moment. And a woman whose story continues to raise one of the most difficult questions of modern policing. When someone is experiencing their darkest moment, how does society choose to respond? Because on that October night in the Bronx, the answer changed everything. The Bronx has always carried many stories at the same time. It is a place of contradictions, where struggle and resilience often exist side by side. For decades, the borough has been portrayed through images of poverty, crime, and hardship. But beyond those headlines is another reality: communities filled with families, longtime residents, artists, workers, and people who have spent their lives trying to build stability in an environment shaped by constant change. By the fall of 2016, the Bronx was a borough still carrying the memories of difficult decades but also experiencing transformation. New buildings were rising. Neighborhoods were changing. Businesses were opening. Yet many residents continued to face challenges that had existed for generations, including economic inequality, limited access to healthcare, and the daily struggle of living with social problems that were often much larger than any single individual. In the Castle Hill section of the Bronx stood the Jamie Towers housing complex, a large residential building where Deborah Danner had lived. Like many public housing developments in New York City, Jamie Towers was home to hundreds of people from different backgrounds. Behind every apartment door was a different story. Some residents were elderly people who had lived there for decades. Some were families raising children. Some were individuals dealing with personal battles that their neighbors might never fully understand. From the outside, an apartment building can appear ordinary. Hallways, elevators, doors, and concrete walls may look the same from one floor to another. But behind those doors are private struggles that are often invisible to the outside world. For Deborah Danner, that private struggle was her lifelong battle with schizophrenia. Mental illness is often misunderstood because it does not always reveal itself in obvious ways. A person can appear completely normal in one moment and then experience overwhelming fear, confusion, or distress in another. Schizophrenia is a complex condition that can affect how a person thinks, feels, and interprets reality. Symptoms can include hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thoughts, and periods of severe emotional distress. But the diagnosis itself does not tell the full story of a person's life. A mental illness does not erase someone's personality. It does not remove their memories. It does not eliminate their dreams. And it does not define their entire identity. Deborah Danner spent years trying to prove exactly that. Through her writing, she attempted to explain what it felt like to live with schizophrenia. She wanted people to understand that behind the diagnosis was a human being trying to survive. Her memoir was not simply a record of illness. It was a record of endurance. She wrote about the challenges she faced, the moments when her thoughts became difficult to control, and the importance of faith and family in helping her continue forward. For Deborah, sharing her experience was a way of creating understanding. But the world around her was not always prepared to offer that understanding. Across the United States, the relationship between police officers and people experiencing mental health crises had become one of the most difficult issues facing communities. Every day, officers responded to calls involving people who were frightened, confused, emotionally overwhelmed, or experiencing psychiatric emergencies. These situations placed enormous pressure on first responders. Police officers are trained primarily to deal with threats, crimes, and situations requiring immediate control. But mental health crises often require something different. They require patience. They require communication. They require time. A person experiencing a psychiatric episode may not respond the way a person in a normal conversation would respond. Commands that seem simple to an officer may feel threatening to someone who is frightened or disconnected from reality. The challenge is finding a way to reduce fear rather than increase it. In New York City, the police department had recognized this challenge for years. The NYPD had programs designed to train officers in dealing with emotionally disturbed persons. But despite training and policies, difficult encounters continued. The reality was that every situation was different. Every person in crisis brought a different history. Every apartment, every hallway, every conversation created a new set of circumstances. There was no perfect formula. And sometimes, the difference between life and death could come down to a few seconds and a few decisions. Before Deborah Danner's death, she was already known to authorities because of previous mental health-related incidents. Her condition had led to moments when police or emergency responders were called to assist her. But those previous encounters had not ended in tragedy. They had ended with Deborah receiving help. That history would later become an important part of the public discussion surrounding her death. Many people questioned why a situation that had previously been managed without deadly force ended differently on October 18, 2016. The answer would depend on whose account was believed. The officer's account. The witnesses' accounts. The evidence presented in court. But before those questions reached a courtroom, there was a larger issue that many people were already discussing. How should society respond when someone's greatest danger comes from their own mind rather than from another person? For families who have loved ones living with serious mental illness, this question is not theoretical. It is part of everyday life. A phone call to 911 can represent hope. It can mean that help is finally arriving. But it can also create fear. Because the same system designed to provide assistance may involve police officers carrying weapons and trained to respond to danger. This tension existed long before Deborah Danner's name became nationally known. Her case simply brought that tension into focus. The evening of October 18, 2016, did not begin as a confrontation between a suspect and law enforcement. It began as a call from a community member who believed someone needed assistance. That detail would remain at the center of the debate. Because when the police arrive at a person's home during a mental health crisis, the purpose is supposed to be protection. The goal is supposed to be bringing the person through the crisis safely. But on that night in the Bronx, the outcome was different. The apartment where Deborah had spent years living became the place where her life ended. The hallway where neighbors once passed each other became connected to a tragedy that would attract national attention. And the question that followed was not only what happened inside those few minutes. It was how a system designed to protect vulnerable people could fail one of them. To understand why Deborah Danner's death created such a powerful reaction, it is necessary to look beyond the police encounter itself. It is necessary to understand the woman at the center of the story. Not only the woman described in official reports. Not only the name mentioned in news headlines. But Deborah Danner herself. Her experiences. Her struggles. Her attempts to be understood. Because every tragedy begins with a person. And before Deborah became a symbol in a national debate, she was simply a woman who had spent a lifetime fighting to live with dignity before her name appeared in newspaper headlines. Before her death became part of a national debate about police response and mental health. Before strangers across the country discussed the final moments of her life. Deborah Danner was simply a woman trying to be understood. She was a daughter. A neighbor. A writer. A person who spent decades living with a condition that many people feared because they did not understand it. Her story was not created by the final minutes inside her Bronx apartment. Her story began long before that. Deborah Danner lived with schizophrenia from a young age, a diagnosis that would shape many parts of her life. The condition affected the way she experienced the world, sometimes creating moments of fear, confusion, and distress. But those moments were only one part of who she was. For many people who knew Deborah, the diagnosis was not the first thing that came to mind when they thought of her. They saw a person. Someone with memories. Someone with beliefs. Someone with a voice. And Deborah worked hard to make sure that voice was heard. In 2011, she published her memoir, My Mama's Love, a life journey of faith and triumph. Writing a book about mental illness requires a level of honesty that many people find difficult. Mental health struggles are often surrounded by silence. People may hide their experiences because they fear judgment, rejection, or being treated differently. Deborah chose another path. She wrote. She opened a window into her personal experience and attempted to explain what life was like from her perspective. Her book was not simply about illness. It was about survival. It was about the relationship between pain and hope. It was about a woman refusing to allow a diagnosis to become the only description of her existence. Through her writing, Deborah tried to show that people living with mental illness were not just medical cases or emergency calls. They were human beings with emotions, memories, and dreams. That message would become painfully significant after her death. Because in the years following the shooting, much of the public conversation focused on one question. What happened during the encounter with police? But another question was equally important. Who was Deborah Danner before that moment? The answer was a woman who had spent much of her life navigating challenges that most people never saw. Living with schizophrenia can mean facing battles that happen internally, invisible to everyone around you. A person may look calm from the outside while experiencing overwhelming thoughts and emotions. A person may hear or believe things that others cannot understand. A person may struggle to explain what is happening inside their own mind. For Deborah, managing her condition required strength and persistence. Like many people living with serious mental illness, she experienced periods of stability and periods of crisis. There were moments when she needed support. There were moments when others became concerned about her well-being. But those moments did not erase the rest of her life. Her previous encounters with emergency responders had not resulted in tragedy. When she experienced mental health episodes, people around her had sometimes been able to help her without violence. That history would later become an important point raised by those questioning the circumstances of her death. They asked why this particular encounter ended differently. Why did a situation involving a woman known to have mental health challenges escalate into a fatal shooting? The answer would become the subject of investigation, court proceedings, and public debate. But behind the legal arguments was a family mourning someone they knew as more than a case file. For loved ones, Deborah was not a headline. She was not a statistic. She was not simply another name added to a growing national conversation. She was someone they had shared life with. Someone whose absence created an empty space that could not be filled by court decisions or public statements. The pain experienced by families after a sudden death is often complicated by unanswered questions. When someone dies in an ordinary accident, families may search for understanding. When someone dies during a controversial encounter, families often search for accountability as well. They want to know what happened. They want every detail examined. They want the world to recognize that the person who died had a life before the tragedy. For Deborah's family, that meant making sure she was remembered as a complete person. Not only as the woman who died in a police shooting. Not only as the woman whose illness was mentioned in reports. But as Deborah. A woman who wrote about her experiences. A woman who wanted compassion. A woman who believed her story mattered. The circumstances of her death would later create intense discussions about police training, mental health services, and the use of force. But those conversations carried an important responsibility. They had to remember the individual at the center. Because behind every discussion about policy is a human life. Behind every statistic is a person. And behind every tragic headline is a story that began years earlier. Deborah's story was one of struggle, but it was also one of determination. She lived through decades of challenges that many people around her may never have fully understood. Yet she continued. She found ways to express herself. She documented her experiences. She tried to educate others. In many ways, her life represented the very thing that mental health advocates have long emphasized. A diagnosis does not define a person. A person is more than their worst moments. A crisis does not represent an entire lifetime. But on October 18, 2016, the world would come to know Deborah because of one moment. A moment inside a small apartment in the Bronx. A moment involving fear, confusion, and a decision that could never be reversed. The details of those final minutes would later be debated in court. Witnesses would describe what they saw. Investigators would examine evidence. Attorneys would argue over responsibility. But before entering that apartment, before the police arrived, before the sound of gunfire changed everything, Deborah Danner had already lived a full and complicated life. She had fought battles most people never witnessed. She had shared her story in the hope that others would understand. And she had spent years proving that a person living with mental illness could still have a voice, a purpose, and a place in the world. The tragedy of Deborah Danner's death was not only that a life ended. It was that a life that had fought so hard to be understood became the center of a conversation about misunderstanding. Her final chapter would be written by others. Investigators, lawyers, police officials, judges. But Deborah's story began with her. And to understand the tragedy that followed, it is necessary to return to the evening when a simple call for help brought police officers to her door. The evening of October 18, 2016, began with a phone call. A call that, on the surface, appeared routine. A neighbor in the Castle Hill section of the Bronx had become concerned about Deborah Danner's behavior. There were reports that she was shouting and acting in a way that suggested she might be experiencing a mental health crisis. The decision to call 911 was not made because someone wanted Deborah punished. It was made because someone believed she needed assistance. For many people living in communities across New York City, this kind of call is filled with uncertainty. When a loved one, a neighbor, or someone nearby begins experiencing a psychiatric emergency, people often do not know what to do. They may not know how to calm the situation. They may not know whether the person is a danger to themselves. They may not know whether medical professionals, social workers, or police officers are the right response. So they call the number that exists for emergencies. And on that evening, that call brought first responders to Deborah Danner's apartment. At first, the situation did not appear to be a criminal matter. There was no report of a crime taking place. There was no allegation that Deborah had attacked another person. The officers were responding to a person believed to be experiencing an emotional disturbance. These encounters require a different approach from traditional police calls. There is no suspect to chase. There is no crime scene to secure. The person in front of the officer may not fully understand why others are worried. The goal is supposed to be stabilization. The goal is to reduce fear. The goal is to bring the person through the crisis safely. When officers and emergency medical personnel entered Deborah's apartment, they found a 66-year-old woman in distress. According to testimony later presented during legal proceedings, Deborah was holding a pair of scissors. The sight of a weapon, even a small one, immediately changed the level of concern inside the apartment. For officers, a person holding any object that could potentially cause harm requires careful attention. But the context was also important. This was not a stranger encountered on a street. This was Deborah's home. This was a woman known to have a history of mental health challenges. This was a situation where the way people communicated with her could influence what happened next. The emergency medical personnel who arrived attempted to speak with Deborah. According to testimony from EMS worker Brittany Mullings, communication between responders and Deborah was possible. They engaged with her. They attempted to calm her. And at some point, Deborah put down the scissors. That detail would later become one of the most significant parts of the case. Because it suggested that the situation may have been moving away from immediate danger. A person who moments earlier had been holding scissors was no longer holding them. The crisis had not disappeared. Deborah was still experiencing a mental health episode. But the immediate threat appeared different. The encounter was still fragile. Still unpredictable. Still requiring caution. But it was no longer exactly the same situation that officers first encountered. Then Sergeant Hugh Barry arrived. Barry was an experienced NYPD officer who had responded to many situations during his career. As the supervising officer at the scene, his role was to take control of the situation and make decisions about how officers would proceed. What happened after his arrival would become the central issue in the investigation. According to witnesses, Barry did not participate in the same extended conversation with Deborah that EMS personnel had been having. The interaction between the officers and Deborah changed. The focus shifted toward gaining control of the apartment and the situation. At some point, Deborah moved toward her bedroom. The officers followed. Inside that smaller space, with limited room and multiple officers present, the situation became increasingly tense. The exact sequence of events inside those final moments would later become the subject of intense disagreement. According to Sergeant Barry's account, Deborah picked up a wooden baseball bat. He stated that she moved toward him with the bat and that he believed he was about to be struck. In that moment, Barry said he feared for his safety. He fired his weapon. 2 shots. Both struck Deborah in the chest. Within seconds, the situation changed completely. The emergency call that began with a request for help had become a fatal police shooting. The apartment that was supposed to be the place where Deborah received assistance became the place where she suffered life-threatening injuries. Emergency responders immediately began efforts to save her life. Deborah was transported to Jacobi Medical Center. But despite medical treatment, she died. The final moments of her life would soon be examined from every possible angle. What exactly happened inside the bedroom? How close was Deborah to Sergeant Barry? Was the baseball bat raised? Was there enough time for another option? Could the situation have been handled differently? These questions would define the case. Because in police use of force investigations, the details of seconds matter. A decision made in a moment can determine whether someone goes home or whether a family receives devastating news. Supporters of Sergeant Barry argued that officers must be allowed to make split-second decisions when they believe their lives are in danger. They pointed to the reported presence of the baseball bat and argued that the officer reacted to a perceived threat. But critics questioned whether deadly force was necessary. They argued that Deborah's mental health crisis should have changed the approach. They pointed to the fact that she had previously put down the scissors. They questioned why communication did not continue. They questioned why less lethal options, including a taser that Barry carried, were not used. For Deborah's family and many advocates, the tragedy was not only the fact that she died. It was the belief that her death could have been prevented. They argued that the purpose of responding to a mental health crisis should be protecting the person experiencing it, not creating another tragedy. As news of the shooting spread through New York City, the story quickly became part of a much larger national conversation. The country was already debating police shootings, accountability, and the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. Deborah Danner's death added another difficult question. How should police respond when the person in crisis is not an enemy, but someone who needs help? The investigation would attempt to answer what happened. The courts would later decide whether Sergeant Barry's actions were criminal. But before the legal process began, one fact was already undeniable. A woman who had spent decades living with mental illness had died during an encounter that began because someone wanted her to receive assistance. And inside the Bronx apartment where those final moments unfolded, every decision, every movement, and every second would become the focus of a case that would challenge how society understands crisis, compassion, and responsibility. In the aftermath of the shooting, the apartment where Deborah Danner had lived became the center of an intense investigation. Only hours earlier, it had been a private space. A place where Deborah slept, wrote, and lived her daily life. A place filled with personal memories. Now it had become a scene examined by investigators searching for answers. Every detail mattered. The position of objects. The statements of witnesses. The timeline of events. The actions of each person inside the apartment. Because when a police officer uses deadly force, the investigation is not only about what happened. It is about why it happened. It is about understanding the decisions made in those critical moments when a situation moved from a crisis intervention to a fatal encounter. For investigators, the first challenge was reconstructing the sequence of events. The initial 911 call. The arrival of officers and emergency personnel. The conversations with Deborah. The moment she reportedly put down the scissors. The arrival of Sergeant Hugh Barry. The movement toward the bedroom. The shooting. Each part of the timeline would become important. A few seconds could change the interpretation of an entire incident. The investigation would need to determine what was known by the officers at each moment. Not what people knew afterward. Not what could be understood with hindsight. But what information was available to the people standing inside that apartment. This distinction would later become central in court. Police officers are often judged on whether their decisions were reasonable based on the circumstances they faced at the time. But those circumstances can be interpreted differently by different people. For one person, a movement may look like an attack. For another, it may appear to be confusion caused by a mental health crisis. For one person, an object may represent an immediate threat. For another, it may represent something that could have been handled differently. And in Deborah Danner's case, nearly every major question would have two competing explanations. The apartment itself contained the physical evidence of the encounter. Investigators examined the location where Deborah was shot. They looked at the objects inside the home. They analyzed the presence of the scissors and the baseball bat. They studied the positions of the people involved. But physical evidence could only answer some questions. It could show what existed. It could not always explain what someone was thinking. It could not fully reveal fear, confusion, hesitation, or judgment during those final seconds. That is why witness testimony became so important. Among the key witnesses was EMS worker Brittany Mullings. Her account would later become a major part of the discussion surrounding the case. Mullings had been inside the apartment during the encounter. She had witnessed the interaction between responders and Deborah before the shooting. According to her testimony, Deborah had already placed the scissors down while she was being engaged by emergency personnel. This became one of the most debated points in the case. Because if Deborah no longer had the scissors, investigators had to consider what level of threat remained at that moment. The question was not whether Deborah was experiencing a mental health crisis. Everyone involved agreed that she was. The question was whether that crisis created a situation where deadly force was justified. Witnesses described an environment filled with uncertainty. Deborah was not behaving like a person involved in a traditional police confrontation. She was a woman experiencing a psychiatric emergency inside her own home. The response required officers to balance two responsibilities: protecting themselves and others while also protecting the person in crisis. That balance is one of the most difficult challenges faced by law enforcement. The investigation also examined the actions of Sergeant Hugh Barry. Barry had extensive experience as a police officer. He had responded to many dangerous situations throughout his career. From his perspective, the moment he fired his weapon was based on a threat he believed was immediate and serious. He stated that Deborah had picked up a wooden baseball bat and moved toward him. He believed she was about to strike him. That belief became the foundation of his legal defense. The prosecution would later argue that the circumstances did not justify the use of deadly force. They questioned whether the situation could have been handled differently. They focused on the possibility of continuing communication. They pointed to the fact that Deborah had already responded to attempts to calm her. They questioned why other options were not used before a firearm. One of those options became a particularly important issue. Sergeant Barry was carrying a taser. The question became, why was the taser not used? Supporters of the prosecution argued that a less lethal option could have created an opportunity to control the situation without taking Deborah's life. The defense argued that the circumstances unfolded too quickly and that Barry had to make an immediate decision. The investigation was not simply about one officer and one shooting. It became part of a broader examination of how police departments respond to people experiencing mental health crises. Across the country, communities had been asking similar questions. When someone is experiencing a psychiatric emergency, should police be the first responders? How much training should officers receive? How can authorities reduce the possibility of a deadly outcome? Deborah's case became one example of a much larger national problem. The tragedy was not isolated. Every year, police officers respond to countless calls involving people experiencing mental health emergencies. Some end peacefully. Others become dangerous. And some, like Deborah's case, end with irreversible consequences. For her family, the investigation was not just a legal process. It was a search for accountability. They wanted the circumstances of Deborah's death examined carefully. They wanted people to understand that she was not simply a person involved in a police incident. She was someone who had lived a full life. Someone who had struggled. Someone who had written about her experiences. Someone who had tried to make others understand what it meant to live with mental illness. As investigators continued gathering evidence, public attention around the case grew. The shooting raised immediate concerns among community leaders and mental health advocates. Many questioned whether the system designed to help people like Deborah had failed. Others argued that police officers should not be judged unfairly for making decisions during dangerous situations. The debate became emotional because both sides were confronting the same reality. A woman had died. A family had lost someone they loved. And the circumstances surrounding that death required answers. The investigation would eventually move from the apartment in the Bronx to the courtroom. Evidence collected at the scene would be presented. Witnesses would testify. Arguments would be made about what happened in those final moments. But before the legal battle began, one thing was clear. The case of Deborah Danner was no longer only about what happened on October 18, 2016. It had become a question about responsibility. A question about training. A question about how a society responds to its most vulnerable members. And at the center of all those questions remained the same person. Deborah Danner. A woman whose life had been shaped by her struggle to be understood. And whose death forced thousands of people to ask whether, in her final moments, someone should have tried harder to understand her. After the death of Deborah Danner, the investigation moved beyond the walls of her Bronx apartment. The physical scene had been documented. Evidence had been collected. Witnesses had been identified. But the most important questions could not be answered by photographs or reports alone. They depended on testimony. They depended on interpretation. And they depended on understanding what happened during the brief moments when a mental health crisis became a deadly encounter. From the beginning, the case was shaped by two very different versions of the same event. One version came from Sergeant Hugh Barry. The other came from witnesses who questioned whether deadly force was necessary. At the center of the disagreement was a single moment inside Deborah's bedroom. A moment that would determine the future of a police officer and become a source of pain for a grieving family. According to Sergeant Barry's account, he entered Deborah Danner's apartment during a tense situation. He knew that officers had encountered a woman experiencing a mental health crisis. He knew she had previously been holding scissors. He knew that the situation could change quickly. According to Barry, the danger escalated when Deborah picked up a wooden baseball bat. He stated that she moved toward him with the bat, creating a situation where he believed he was facing an immediate threat of serious injury. In his view, he had only seconds to respond. He made the decision to fire. 2 shots were fired. Deborah Danner fell. But the interpretation of those moments was disputed. For prosecutors and critics of the shooting, the central question was whether the threat described by Barry justified the use of deadly force. They argued that Deborah was not a criminal suspect. She was a woman experiencing a psychiatric emergency. They argued that the situation required patience and de-escalation rather than a rapid transition toward force. The investigation examined whether officers had other options available. Could they have created more distance? Could they have continued communication? Could they have waited for additional support? Could they have used equipment designed to restrain someone without causing fatal injuries? These questions became increasingly important as details of the encounter became public. One of the most discussed issues was the presence of a taser. Sergeant Barry carried a taser, a device designed to temporarily incapacitate a person without the same level of danger associated with a firearm. Critics questioned why that option was not used. They argued that if Deborah was holding a baseball bat, a less lethal tool might have offered another way to end the confrontation. But the defense presented a different argument. A person facing what they believe is an immediate deadly threat may not have time to carefully consider every possible option. The defense emphasized the unpredictability of such encounters. A baseball bat can cause severe injury. A person holding one can move quickly. And an officer who believes a strike is about to happen may have only a moment to act. This difference in perspective became the foundation of the legal debate. The question was not simply, did Deborah have a mental illness? Everyone agreed she did. The question was, what did Sergeant Barry reasonably believe was happening at that exact moment? The investigation also focused on the testimony of EMS worker Brittany Mullings. Her account became significant because she was present during the earlier part of the encounter. Mullings testified that she had been able to communicate with Deborah. She described Deborah as someone who could respond to conversation. Most importantly, she stated that Deborah had put down the scissors. This detail challenged the idea that the entire encounter remained at the same level of danger from beginning to end. The situation had changed. The question was whether officers recognized that change. For Deborah's family and supporters, the fact that she had put down the scissors represented a missed opportunity. They believed the crisis was moving toward a peaceful conclusion. They believed that more time and communication could have prevented her death. They pointed to Deborah's history. She had experienced mental health episodes before. Emergency responders had been called before. But previous encounters had not ended with her being killed. To them, that raised a painful question. Why did this encounter become different? Why did a situation that began as a request for help end with a gunshot? For law enforcement officials, the situation was more complicated. Police officers responding to emotionally disturbed persons' calls must make decisions with limited information. They often enter unpredictable environments. They may not know whether someone has a weapon. They may not know whether a person's behavior will suddenly become violent. They must balance compassion with safety. And sometimes, those responsibilities can collide. The investigation also took place during a period of intense national discussion about police use of force. Across the United States, communities were questioning how officers interacted with civilians, especially people from vulnerable groups and people experiencing mental health emergencies. Cases involving police shootings had sparked protests, investigations, and demands for reform. Deborah Danner's death became part of that larger conversation. For many advocates, her case represented the dangers of sending armed officers into situations that are primarily medical or psychological crises. They argued that mental health emergencies require specialists trained specifically in crisis intervention. They believed that a person experiencing a psychiatric episode should not automatically be placed into an encounter where firearms are present. Others argued that police officers cannot ignore potential threats. They emphasized that officers are often called because a situation has already become difficult for ordinary citizens to manage. The debate reflected a larger question with no easy answer. When someone is in crisis, who should respond? And what should that response look like? As investigators continued their work, the case moved closer toward a legal decision. The Bronx District Attorney's Office examined the evidence. Prosecutors reviewed witness statements. They analyzed the timeline. They considered whether the shooting met the legal standards for justified use of force. The decision would not only affect Sergeant Barry. It would also send a message about accountability in police shootings. Historically, criminal charges against officers involved in fatal shootings have been uncommon. Police officers are given significant legal protection when they make decisions during dangerous situations. The standard is not whether an outcome was tragic. The standard is whether the officer's actions were criminal under the law. That distinction would become crucial. Because almost everyone involved agreed on one fact. Deborah Danner was dead. The disagreement was about why. Was she the victim of unnecessary force? Or was she killed during a moment when an officer reasonably believed his own life was in danger? Those opposing views would eventually be argued in court. But before the courtroom became the next stage of the story, the investigation reached a moment that many people had not expected. The case would not disappear into internal review. It would move forward with criminal charges. For Deborah's family, that decision represented the possibility that her death would receive a full examination before a judge. For Sergeant Hugh Barry, it represented the beginning of a legal battle that could determine his future. The next chapter would not be written inside the apartment where Deborah died. It would be written in courtrooms, through testimony, evidence, and arguments over what truly happened during those final seconds. And as the legal process began, the entire country would watch one question unfold. When an officer says he was afraid, where is the line between a justified decision and a preventable tragedy? For months after Deborah Danner's death, the questions surrounding the Bronx apartment where she was killed remained unanswered. The investigation continued quietly behind official doors. Detectives reviewed evidence. Prosecutors examined testimony. Legal teams studied every detail of the encounter. Every word spoken by witnesses. Every decision made by officers. Every movement inside those final moments. The case was not simply about what happened. It was about whether what happened should lead to criminal accountability. For Deborah's family, the waiting period was filled with uncertainty. When someone dies during an encounter with police, families often find themselves caught between grief and a search for answers. The loss itself is devastating. But when the circumstances are disputed, the grieving process becomes complicated by questions that have no immediate resolution. They wanted to know what happened inside Deborah's apartment. They wanted the world to understand who she was. And they wanted the investigation to recognize that her life mattered beyond the circumstances of her death. For many people watching the case, the possibility of criminal charges against a police officer seemed significant. Historically, police officers involved in fatal shootings have rarely faced murder charges, particularly when they claim they acted to protect themselves from an immediate threat. The legal system gives officers certain protections because their jobs often require decisions to be made under dangerous and rapidly changing conditions. But those protections do not mean officers are automatically immune from investigation. When authorities believe an officer may have crossed the line, criminal proceedings can follow. That possibility became reality in Deborah Danner's case. In May 2017, a Bronx grand jury voted to indict Sergeant Hugh Barry. The charges were serious. Barry faced allegations including second-degree murder, manslaughter, and criminally negligent homicide. The indictment marked a major turning point. The case was no longer only a public debate. It was now a criminal matter that would be examined inside a courtroom. For supporters of Deborah's family, the indictment represented a step toward accountability. They believed the evidence showed that the situation could have been handled differently. They argued that Deborah's mental health crisis should have changed the way officers responded. They believed that the goal should have been protecting her life. For supporters of Sergeant Barry, the indictment raised concerns about the difficulty of police work. They argued that officers responding to dangerous situations must be allowed to protect themselves. They emphasized that Barry believed he was facing a person holding a potentially deadly weapon. They argued that the law must consider what the officer reasonably believed in that moment, not only what was discovered afterward. The indictment forced the court to confront one of the most complicated questions in police use of force cases. How should the law judge a decision made in seconds? The courtroom would not examine the tragedy from an emotional perspective alone. It would focus on legal standards, evidence, testimony, reasonable belief, and whether prosecutors could prove that Barry's actions crossed the legal threshold required for a criminal conviction. The case also drew attention because of the statements made by New York City officials after the shooting. Shortly after Deborah's death, NYPD leadership acknowledged serious concerns about the encounter. Police Commissioner James O'Neill publicly stated that the department had failed in this situation. His statement was unusual. Law enforcement leaders often defend officers while investigations are ongoing. But O'Neill's comments reflected the seriousness of the incident and the concern that the response did not reflect the department's expectations for handling emotionally disturbed persons. Mayor Bill de Blasio also described the shooting as something that should not have happened. Those statements added another layer to the public discussion. They suggested that even before the criminal case was decided, officials recognized the tragedy as a moment requiring examination. But public concern and legal responsibility are not the same thing. A person can believe something went wrong without that belief automatically proving a criminal offense. That distinction would become central during the trial. The prosecution's argument focused on the idea that Deborah's condition and the circumstances of the encounter required a different response. They argued that the officers had opportunities to slow the situation down. They pointed to the earlier communication with Deborah. They questioned whether the decision to move into the bedroom increased the danger. They argued that the use of deadly force was unnecessary. The defense viewed the situation differently. They argued that Sergeant Barry entered a dangerous and unpredictable environment. They argued that Deborah's actions created a legitimate fear of serious injury. They emphasized that the law allows officers to respond with deadly force when they reasonably believe they face an immediate threat. The case would ultimately depend on how a judge interpreted those competing versions of events. Before the trial began, one thing was already clear. The courtroom would not bring Deborah back. No verdict could change the fact that a woman had lost her life. But the trial would determine how the legal system understood what happened. Was this a tragic but justified use of force? Or was it an unnecessary killing of a vulnerable person who needed help? Those questions would follow everyone involved into the courtroom. The prosecution would attempt to show that Deborah's death was preventable. The defense would attempt to show that Sergeant Barry acted according to his training and his perception of danger. And at the center of the case would remain a few critical seconds inside a small bedroom in the Bronx. Seconds that would decide whether a police officer would be held criminally responsible for a woman's death. As the trial approached, the attention surrounding the case grew. Community members, mental health advocates, police reform organizations, and legal experts all watched closely. For many, Deborah Danner's story represented something larger than one police shooting. It represented a question about how society treats people who are experiencing mental health crises. It represented the challenge of balancing public safety with compassion. It represented the difficult reality that sometimes the people most in need of protection are also the people most vulnerable during encounters with authority. The indictment was the first major legal breakthrough. But it was only the beginning. The next battle would take place inside the courtroom, where every witness, every piece of evidence, and every argument would be examined. There, the final moments of Deborah Danner's life would be reconstructed. Not through memory alone. not through public opinion, but through the strict and demanding process of the justice system. And the question waiting at the end of that process was one that had haunted the case from the beginning. Could Deborah Danner's death have been prevented? The courtroom would become the place where the final moments of Deborah Danner's life were examined piece by piece. Inside that room, the tragedy of October 18, 2016, would be transformed into evidence, testimony, and legal arguments. The emotional weight of the case was undeniable. A woman had died inside her own apartment. A police officer had fired his weapon. A family had lost someone they loved. But the courtroom operated by a different set of rules. It was not asked to decide whether the situation was heartbreaking. Everyone already knew that it was. The question before the court was narrower and more difficult. Did Sergeant Hugh Barry commit a crime when he shot Deborah Danner? That question required the court to look beyond emotion and examine the legal standards surrounding the use of deadly force. The defense argued that Barry's actions were justified because he believed he faced an immediate threat. The prosecution argued that the threat did not justify taking Deborah's life. At trial, both sides attempted to recreate the scene inside the Bronx apartment. The courtroom became a place where those few final minutes were replayed again and again. The movement of Deborah. The position of the officers. The presence of the baseball bat. The conversations before the shooting. The choices that were made. Every detail mattered. For prosecutors, the case centered on the belief that the encounter could have been handled differently. They argued that Deborah was a woman experiencing a mental health crisis, not an armed criminal. They emphasized that she had already put down the scissors after emergency personnel spoke with her. To them, that moment showed that communication was possible. They argued that officers had an opportunity to continue de-escalating the situation rather than moving toward a confrontation that ended with gunfire. A major part of the prosecution's argument focused on alternatives. They questioned why more time was not given. Why was the situation allowed to escalate? Why was the taser that Sergeant Barry carried not used? Why did the encounter end with a firearm being discharged? The prosecution wanted the court to see the shooting not as an unavoidable moment, but as the result of decisions that increased the risk. They argued that Deborah's mental state should have been central to how officers approached her. A person experiencing schizophrenia may not respond to commands the same way someone in a normal situation would. Fear, confusion, and distorted perception can influence behavior. For that reason, advocates argue that officers must recognize when a person is not acting out of criminal intent, but because they are experiencing a medical crisis. The defense presented a different picture. They argued that Sergeant Barry was placed in an extremely difficult situation. Police officers, they explained, often enter environments where they do not know exactly what they will encounter. A situation that appears calm can change in seconds. An object that seems harmless can become dangerous. A person who appears cooperative can suddenly move toward violence. According to the defense, Barry did not have the luxury of analyzing every option in a calm environment. He had to react based on what he believed was happening in front of him. They argued that a wooden baseball bat was capable of causing serious injury. They argued that Deborah's movement toward Barry created a legitimate fear that he was about to be struck. And they argued that the law does not judge an officer's actions from a distance, after the danger has passed. It judges whether the officer's decision was reasonable in that moment. This became the central conflict of the trial. Two different interpretations of the same few seconds. One side saw a vulnerable woman who needed more patience. The other side saw an officer facing a threat that required immediate action. The court had to decide which interpretation met the legal standard. The trial also highlighted the complicated nature of police responses to mental health emergencies. Unlike many criminal cases, there was no dispute about whether Deborah was struggling. The disagreement was about how that struggle should have been handled. Her mental illness was not the cause of the legal question. It was part of the context. It shaped how people viewed the encounter. For mental health advocates, the case represented the dangers of relying on armed officers to handle psychiatric crises. They argued that situations involving mental illness require specialized responses focused on treatment and communication. For law enforcement supporters, the case represented the challenges officers face when they must make decisions under pressure. They argued that police officers cannot ignore potential threats simply because a person is experiencing mental illness. The trial reflected this larger national debate. But inside the courtroom, the judge had one responsibility: to determine whether the prosecution had proven criminal wrongdoing beyond a reasonable doubt. In February 2018, the case reached its conclusion. Because of legal decisions made before the trial, the case was heard without a jury. Judge Robert Ney considered the evidence and testimony presented by both sides. After reviewing the case, the judge reached his decision. Sergeant Hugh Barry was found not guilty on all charges. The court determined that prosecutors had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Barry's use of deadly force was unlawful. The decision was a devastating moment for Deborah's family and those who believed she had been wrongfully killed. For them, the verdict did not answer the deeper question of whether her death could have been prevented. They believed the system had failed to recognize her vulnerability. They believed the encounter should never have reached the point where a gun was fired. For Sergeant Barry and his supporters, the verdict confirmed their belief that he acted within the law during a dangerous encounter. They argued that he was forced to make a split-second decision and that the court had recognized that reality. The verdict closed one chapter of the case, but it did not end the conversation. A criminal court had answered one question. Was Sergeant Hugh Barry guilty of a crime? The answer was no. But another question remained. Was this the kind of outcome society should accept when responding to someone experiencing a mental health crisis? That question continued beyond the courtroom. Because legal responsibility and public responsibility are not always the same. An action may not meet the standard for a criminal conviction, yet still lead people to demand changes. And that is exactly what happened after the Deborah Danner case. The shooting became part of a broader discussion about police training, crisis intervention, and how communities respond when someone is experiencing severe mental distress. The courtroom had delivered a verdict. But the debate over what happened inside Deborah's apartment was far from over. Her name continued to represent a difficult challenge. How can society protect people during their most vulnerable moments? Because Deborah Danner's death was not only about one officer and one decision. It was about a system struggling with one of its most complicated responsibilities. How to respond when the person in need of help is also someone who may appear unpredictable. How to balance safety with compassion. How to prevent a moment of crisis from becoming a moment of irreversible loss. And for many people, those questions remained long after the judge's final words were spoken. The courtroom decision brought an official conclusion to the criminal case against Sergeant Hugh Barry. But for many people, the story of Deborah Danner did not end with a verdict. A judge's decision could determine whether someone was legally responsible. It could not erase the pain of a family that had lost someone they loved. It could not change what happened inside the Bronx apartment. And it could not answer every question that remained after October 18, 2016. For Deborah's family, the years after her death were shaped by a mixture of grief, frustration, and the desire to make sure she was remembered as more than a police shooting victim. Because before she became part of a national debate, Deborah was a person with a history. She was a woman who lived with a difficult illness but refused to let that illness become the only thing people saw. She was a writer who tried to explain her experience to others. She was someone who believed that telling her story could help create understanding. That part of Deborah's life became even more important after her death. The tragedy forced many people to look beyond the final moments of her life and consider the decades that came before. For mental health advocates, Deborah's case represented a familiar concern. People experiencing psychiatric crises often encounter emergency systems at their most vulnerable moments. A person who needs medical support may instead find themselves facing a situation involving police authority and the possibility of force. The challenge is not simple. Police officers are often called because a situation has become difficult or frightening. They are expected to protect everyone involved, including the person experiencing the crisis. But mental health emergencies are different from traditional law enforcement situations. The goal is not to arrest. The goal is not to punish. The goal is to help someone safely move through a moment when they may not have control over their thoughts, emotions, or actions. Deborah Danner's death became one of the cases used to question whether existing systems were prepared for that responsibility. Across the country, communities began discussing alternatives. Should mental health professionals respond alongside or instead of police officers in certain situations? Should crisis intervention training become more extensive? Should emergency systems create different pathways for people experiencing psychiatric emergencies? These questions were not created by Deborah's case alone. But her story gave those discussions a human face. It placed a name and a life behind broader statistics and policy debates. In New York City, officials continued examining how officers responded to emotionally disturbed persons' calls. The NYPD had already developed procedures and training programs designed to help officers manage these encounters. But the Deborah Danner case showed the difficulty of applying those principles in real situations. Training can provide guidance. Policies can provide structure. But every crisis is different. Every person is different. And every encounter unfolds under its own circumstances. One of the most significant reactions after the shooting came from police leadership itself. NYPD Commissioner James O'Neill publicly acknowledged that the department had failed in the handling of Deborah's case. His statement drew attention because it reflected a recognition that even when legal questions remain, an outcome can still reveal deeper problems. The statement suggested that accountability is not only about criminal convictions. It is also about examining procedures, decisions, and whether a system is functioning as it should. The aftermath also affected the career of Sergeant Hugh Barry. Although he was found not guilty in criminal court, his situation did not end there. Police departments have internal disciplinary processes separate from criminal courts. The standards are different. An officer may avoid criminal conviction but still face administrative consequences. In Barry's case, an internal review later concluded that he violated department rules, and disciplinary proceedings resulted in action against him. Eventually, he left the NYPD. This distinction between criminal justice and internal discipline became another important part of the discussion surrounding the case. A criminal court asks whether a person committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. An internal disciplinary process asks whether an employee violated professional standards. Those are different questions. And they can produce different outcomes. For some observers, the disciplinary action represented recognition that something went wrong, even though the criminal case ended with an acquittal. For others, the outcome reflected the complexity of police encounters and the difficulty of judging decisions made during moments of perceived danger. But beyond legal arguments and policy discussions was the memory of Deborah herself. Her story continued to challenge the way society often views people with mental illness. Too often, people experiencing psychiatric conditions are reduced to moments of crisis. Their struggles become the focus. Their humanity becomes secondary. Deborah's life showed why that perspective is incomplete. She was not only a person who experienced schizophrenia. She was a person who wrote. A person who reflected on her life. A person who attempted to educate others. A person who had hopes, fears, and experiences that existed long before the police arrived at her apartment. Her memoir remains an important part of understanding her story because it shows that she wanted people to see the person behind the diagnosis. She wanted understanding instead of judgment. She wanted compassion instead of fear. And that message became especially powerful after her death. The tragedy of Deborah Danner's case lies partly in the fact that the situation began with an intention to help. Someone called 911 because they were concerned. Responders arrived because they were expected to provide assistance. Yet the result was a death that sparked anger, debate, and calls for change. That contradiction is what made the case so painful. A system designed to respond to emergencies had produced an outcome that many people considered another emergency of its own. Years later, Deborah Danner's name remains connected to difficult conversations about mental health, policing, and accountability. Her death became part of a larger movement questioning how society responds to people in crisis. But perhaps the most important lesson from her story is the one she tried to communicate during her lifetime. A person is more than their illness. A moment of crisis does not define an entire life. And behind every emergency call is a human being with a story that began long before anyone arrived at the door. Deborah Danner's final moments became the focus of national attention. But her life was much larger than those final moments. She was a woman who struggled, survived, and tried to make herself understood. And the questions raised by her death continue because they touch something fundamental. When someone is at their most vulnerable, what kind of response does society owe them? The answer to that question remains one of the most difficult challenges facing communities, law enforcement, and mental health systems today. Years after the night Deborah Danner died, the questions surrounding her case continued to echo. The apartment in Castle Hill where the shooting occurred was no longer the center of a criminal investigation. The courtroom proceedings had ended. The legal arguments had been made. A verdict had been delivered. But the larger conversation that emerged from Deborah's death remained alive. Because some cases do not disappear when the final court document is filed. Some cases become part of a much bigger discussion about society, responsibility, and the way vulnerable people are treated. The story of Deborah Danner became one of those cases. It became a reminder that moments of crisis are rarely simple. They are moments where fear, confusion, training, and human judgment all collide. And sometimes, the decisions made in those moments have consequences that cannot be undone. Deborah's death forced many people to look closely at the relationship between mental illness and law enforcement. For decades, police departments across the United States have often been the first responders when someone experiences a psychiatric emergency. A family member becomes frightened. A neighbor hears disturbing behavior. Someone appears unable to care for themselves. The instinct is often to call emergency services. But emergency systems are traditionally designed around danger. Police officers are trained to respond to threats. They are trained to identify risks. They are trained to take control of unpredictable situations. Those skills are essential. But mental health crises often require a different approach. They require understanding. They require patience. They require recognizing that a person may not be acting out of criminal intent. They may be responding to a reality that others cannot see. Deborah's case highlighted the difficult space where these two worlds meet. The world of law enforcement and the world of mental health care. For many mental health advocates, the lesson was clear. A person experiencing a psychiatric crisis should receive a response focused on care whenever possible. They argued that crisis intervention should involve professionals trained specifically in mental health situations. They believed that sending armed officers into these encounters can create risks, especially when the person involved is frightened, confused, or unable to respond normally. Supporters of law enforcement, however, pointed to another reality. Police officers are often called during situations that are already unstable. They do not always know what they will find when they arrive. They may encounter someone who appears calm one moment and dangerous the next. They must protect themselves, their colleagues, and the public. They argued that officers should not be expected to ignore possible threats simply because a person is experiencing mental illness. This tension remains one of the most complicated issues in modern policing. The question is not whether safety matters. It does. The question is how safety can be achieved while also protecting the dignity and life of the person in crisis. Deborah Danner's story became part of the search for that balance. Her case encouraged discussions about improving crisis response programs. It reinforced the importance of training officers to recognize signs of mental illness. It increased attention on de-escalation techniques. And it encouraged communities to consider whether police should always be the first response to every mental health emergency. One of the most important lessons from cases like Deborah's is that prevention often begins before a crisis reaches the point of emergency. Mental health resources, community support, early intervention, and accessible treatment can all play a role in reducing dangerous situations. But these resources are not always equally available. Many families living with serious mental illness have faced the same frightening question. What should we do when our loved one is experiencing a crisis? They may want help. They may need help. But they may also fear what happens when emergency responders arrive. That fear is one of the lasting impacts of cases like Deborah Danner's. For some families, calling for help is no longer a simple decision. It carries uncertainty. Will the person receive care? Will the situation calm down? Will the response protect the person or place them at greater risk? These are difficult questions. And they show why the conversation surrounding Deborah's death extends far beyond one apartment, one officer, or one night. It is about creating systems where seeking help does not create additional fear. It is about ensuring that people experiencing mental health emergencies are treated as people first. For Deborah's supporters, remembering her means remembering more than the circumstances of her death. It means remembering the woman who wrote about her experiences. The woman who wanted people to understand mental illness. The woman who attempted to turn personal suffering into a message of awareness. Her memoir remains a reminder that people living with mental health conditions are not defined by their struggles. They have personalities. They have histories. They have contributions to make. They have lives beyond the moments when they need help. That message became one of the most powerful parts of Deborah's legacy. Her life challenged society to look deeper. To see beyond a diagnosis. To see beyond a police report. To see the person behind the crisis. The tragedy of October 18, 2016, cannot be separated from the broader issues that followed. The questions about police training. The debate about emergency response. The discussion about accountability. All of these issues became connected to Deborah's name. But her story should not end only with questions about what went wrong. It should also include questions about what can be learned. How can future tragedies be prevented? How can communities build better systems of support? How can first responders be better prepared? How can society respond to mental illness with more understanding? Those questions remain unanswered in many places. But every discussion, every reform effort, and every attempt to improve crisis response carries a connection to people like Deborah. People whose lives revealed the weaknesses of existing systems. People whose experiences forced society to reconsider old approaches. Deborah Danner spent much of her life trying to explain what it meant to live with schizophrenia. She wanted people to understand that mental illness was not the absence of humanity. It was simply one part of a much larger story. Her death brought attention to the very issue she had spent years trying to explain. That people living with mental illness deserve compassion. They deserve patience. They deserve to be seen as individuals. The final chapter of Deborah Dana's story is not only about a tragic encounter. It is also about the responsibility that follows tragedy. The responsibility to learn. The responsibility to improve. And the responsibility to remember the person at the center of it all. Deborah Dana was more than the last moments of her life. She was more than a police report. She was more than a national debate. She was a woman who lived, struggled, wrote, and hoped that others would understand her. And perhaps the most lasting question her story leaves behind is not only what happened on that October evening. It is what society chooses to do afterward. Because every tragedy creates a choice. To forget. Or to learn. And the legacy of Deborah Dana continues through those who believe that learning is the only way to make sure another person facing a moment of crisis receives the help they need, not a fate they cannot escape. Even after the criminal trial ended and the legal process reached its conclusion, the story of Deborah Dana continued to raise difficult questions. Some cases end with a clear answer. A verdict is delivered. A sentence is announced. A chapter closes. But Deborah Dana's case was different. The court answered one question, whether Sergeant Hugh Barry was criminally responsible under the law. But it did not answer every question that people continued to ask. Could the encounter have ended differently? Could another decision have changed the outcome? Could more time, more communication, or another approach have saved Deborah's life? These questions remained because the tragedy existed in a space where legal responsibility and human responsibility overlap, but do not always produce the same conclusion. A court must determine whether a crime occurred. But communities often ask a broader question. Was this the best possible response? That distinction became central to the debate surrounding Deborah's death. For many people who followed the case, the most painful part was the fact that the situation began with a request for assistance. The call to 911 was not made because Deborah had committed a crime. It was made because someone was worried about her. Someone believed she needed support. Someone wanted emergency responders to intervene. That starting point shaped how many people viewed the tragedy. They saw it as a failure of a system that was supposed to protect someone during a vulnerable moment. For Deborah's supporters, the details before the shooting were especially important. They focused on the fact that emergency personnel had been able to communicate with her. They focused on the fact that she had put down the scissors. They believed those moments demonstrated that the situation was not beyond control. They questioned whether the response should have slowed down instead of moving toward confrontation. They argued that Deborah's mental state should have been the most important factor in deciding how to proceed. A person experiencing schizophrenia may not interpret events the same way as someone without that condition. A person may perceive danger where others see safety. A person may react to fear rather than reality. In those moments, traditional commands and authority-based approaches may not work. Instead, advocates argue, responders must understand the person's perspective and attempt to reduce the fear driving the behavior. This idea became one of the most important discussions after Deborah's death. How do you communicate with someone who is experiencing a reality different from your own? How do you build trust when the person may already feel threatened? How do you create safety without making the person feel trapped? These questions are at the heart of crisis intervention. But the case also raised another difficult issue. The perspective of the officer. Sergeant Hugh Barry was not responding to the situation with the knowledge that would later emerge in investigations and courtrooms. He was inside the apartment during a rapidly changing encounter. From his perspective, he believed he faced a dangerous threat. He believed the baseball bat represented an immediate risk. He believed he had to make a decision quickly. Supporters of police officers in similar situations often argue that it is easy to criticize decisions after the danger has passed. A person watching a video or reading a report has time to analyze. An officer at the scene may have only seconds. This difference between hindsight and real-time decision-making is one of the most difficult issues in police use of force cases. The officer sees the situation as it unfolds. The public sees the situation after everything is already known. Both perspectives matter. And the challenge is finding a standard that recognizes both public safety and individual rights. Deborah Danner's case also raised questions about the role of police in mental health emergencies. Police officers are often expected to handle situations that go far beyond traditional law enforcement. They respond to homelessness, substance abuse crises, domestic conflicts, mental health emergencies. They are often called because there is no other immediate option. But whether police should be the primary responders in these situations has become a major national discussion. Many mental health professionals argue that crisis situations involving psychiatric illness should involve people trained specifically in mental health care. They believe that a medical emergency should receive a medical response. Others argue that police will continue to be involved because they are often the first available responders when a situation becomes unpredictable. The debate is not simple. There are no easy answers. But Deborah's story forced many people to confront the consequences of relying on a single system to solve problems that are deeply complex. Her case also highlighted the importance of understanding the lives of people who experience mental illness. Often, public attention focuses only on moments of crisis. A person becomes known because of an emergency call, an incident, or a tragedy. But that moment represents only a small part of an entire life. Deborah had spent years living with schizophrenia. She had experienced challenges. She had faced moments when she needed help. But she had also written a book. She had shared her experiences. She had attempted to educate others. She had a story beyond the crisis. Remembering that became an important part of the conversation after her death. Because one of the dangers of discussing mental illness only through emergencies is that people become defined by their most difficult moments. Deborah's life showed why that is unfair. A person is not a diagnosis. A person is not a police report. A person is not the final minutes of their life. As years passed, the questions surrounding Deborah Danner's death became part of a larger movement toward rethinking crisis response. Communities across the country explored different models. Some developed teams involving mental health professionals. Some expanded crisis intervention training. Some examined ways to reduce situations where police and people experiencing psychiatric emergencies come into dangerous contact. These efforts were shaped by many cases, including Deborah's. Her story became one example of a national challenge. How can society respond to people in crisis in a way that protects everyone involved? The answer requires more than one solution. It requires resources, training, communication, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, a recognition that behind every emergency call is a person whose life has meaning beyond that single moment. Deborah Danner's death remains controversial because it sits at the intersection of several difficult realities. The reality that police officers face dangerous situations. The reality that people with mental illness can be especially vulnerable. The reality that even well-intentioned emergency responses can have devastating outcomes. Her story does not provide a simple answer. Instead, it forces society to continue asking difficult questions. Questions about preparation. Questions about compassion. Questions about responsibility. And ultimately, questions about what kind of response people deserve when they are at their most fragile. Because the true measure of a system is not only how it responds to ordinary situations. It is how it responds when someone is afraid, confused, and unable to help themselves. And that is why, years later, the name Deborah Danner continues to be remembered. Not only because of how her life ended, but because of the questions her life and death left behind every public debate, every legal argument, and every policy discussion, there is always a human story. Before Deborah Danner became the subject of court proceedings and national conversations, she was a person known by family and friends. She had relationships. She had memories. She had a life that existed long before the events of October 18, 2016. For those who loved her, the most painful part of the tragedy was knowing that the world would often remember Deborah because of the way she died rather than the way she lived. Public attention often focuses on moments of crisis. A police report captures a few minutes. A courtroom examines a specific event. News coverage concentrates on the incident that brought a person into the public eye. But a person's life cannot be measured by one moment. Deborah Danner's story was decades long. It included struggles, but it also included courage. It included challenges, but it also included creativity and determination. She was a woman who spent much of her life trying to explain something that many people found difficult to understand. What it meant to live with schizophrenia. For people who have never experienced serious mental illness, it can be difficult to understand how powerful its effects can be. Mental illness is not always visible. There is often no physical sign that reveals what someone is experiencing internally. A person can walk through a neighborhood, speak with others, and appear ordinary while carrying an invisible burden. For Deborah, that burden was something she had to manage throughout her life. But she did not allow it to erase her identity. One of the most important parts of Deborah's life was her decision to write about her experiences. Her memoir represented an attempt to create understanding. She wanted people to see beyond stereotypes. She wanted people to recognize that those living with mental illness are not defined by moments when their condition becomes difficult to control. Writing about such personal experiences requires vulnerability. It requires a person to reveal parts of themselves that many people would rather keep private. Deborah chose honesty. She shared her struggles because she believed awareness could make a difference. Her story was a reminder that mental illness is not simply a medical diagnosis. It is something that affects real people with real lives. People who have families. People who have dreams. People who deserve dignity. After her death, many people who never met Deborah came to know her through a different lens. They learned about her because of tragedy. They learned about her because of the police shooting. But as advocates and supporters emphasized, Deborah deserved to be remembered for more than the circumstances of her death. She deserved to be remembered as a woman who survived difficult experiences and still found a way to tell her story. For her family, grief was complicated by the public nature of what happened. When someone dies suddenly, families often need time and privacy to process the loss. But when a death becomes the center of national attention, mourning can become connected to public debate. Every statement, every news report, every courtroom development can reopen painful memories. Instead of simply grieving, families may find themselves repeatedly explaining why their loved one mattered. They may feel the need to defend the humanity of the person they lost. This is a burden carried by many families involved in controversial deaths. They are not only mourning. They are also fighting against the possibility that their loved one will be reduced to a single event. For Deborah's supporters, keeping her memory alive meant continuing to talk about the issues she represented. Mental health, compassion, crisis response, the importance of seeing people as individuals. Her story became connected to efforts to improve how communities respond to people experiencing psychiatric emergencies. But the reason those efforts mattered was because there was a person behind them. There was Deborah. A woman whose life demonstrated the complexity of living with mental illness. A woman who had moments of difficulty but also moments of strength. A woman who wanted to be understood. The human cost of cases like Deborah's extends beyond the immediate family. It affects communities as well. Neighbors who witnessed the aftermath may continue carrying memories of that night. First responders involved in the situation may carry their own reflections. Police officers across the country may think about how they would respond in a similar situation. Mental health professionals may consider how systems can be improved. Each person connected to the event experiences it differently. That complexity is part of what makes these cases so difficult. There is rarely one emotion. There is grief. There is anger. There is uncertainty. There is disagreement. And there is the search for meaning after something irreversible happens. One of the most important lessons from Deborah's story is that crisis does not erase humanity. A person experiencing a mental health episode is still a person. They still have a history. They still have relationships. They still have value. This idea may seem simple, but it is often forgotten during moments of emergency. When fear takes over, people can begin seeing only the immediate problem. They may stop seeing the individual behind it. Deborah's life challenges that way of thinking. Her memoir, her experiences, and the stories shared after her death all point toward the same message. Understanding matters. Because misunderstanding can have consequences. The tragedy of Deborah Danner's death was not only that a woman lost her life. It was that a moment when she needed support became the moment that ended her story. That reality continues to affect how people discuss mental health emergencies today. Every crisis call represents a person. Every person has a story. And every response carries consequences. Years after her death, Deborah remains remembered by those who believe her life represented something important. Not perfection. Not an easy journey. But resilience. She lived with a condition that many people feared and misunderstood. Yet she still chose to speak openly. She still chose to write. She still chose to share. In doing so, she left behind something that continued after her death. A message that people living with mental illness deserve to be seen completely. Not as problems to solve. Not as dangers to control. But as human beings deserving patience, dignity, and compassion. The final moments of Deborah Danner's life created a national conversation. But the years before those moments reveal who she truly was. A woman who struggled. A woman who endured. A woman who tried to make the world understand her experience. And perhaps the greatest responsibility after a tragedy like this is to remember the person who was lost. Not only the circumstances. Not only the controversy. Not only the debate. But the life. Because Deborah Danner was never just a case. She was a human being whose story mattered.